Come now, settle in. The night is long, and this story will carry you gently through it. Maren Ashwell arrived at Carendon Palace on a Tuesday in the last week of November. She was 23. She came by hired cart from the coaching road, and the driver had not spoken since the crossroads at Harding. The outer yard of the palace was immense, grey with frost, and larger than anything she had expected. A groom crossed the yard without looking at her. A footman held a door open on the far side and let it close again. Frost had settled over the flagstones like a thin white cloth. The cold was the kind that finds the spaces between buttons, that remembers the back of the neck. Maren's gloves were wool, well darned at the right thumb. She had mended them herself 4 times since autumn. She stepped down from the cart and looked up. The palace rose above her in the last of the afternoon light, stone upon stone, pale as old bone. It had not so much been built, she thought, as grown cold over centuries. Her breath came and went in small white clouds. She paid the driver what she owed. She did not look back at the road. 8 months prior, the Reverend Thomas Ashwell of Harding Parish had died in the early morning, quietly, in his chair. He had left behind a small congregation, a deep affection and debts that came to light in the weeks that followed. The rectory had to be vacated. The furniture went piece by piece, then the books, all but one. The long case clock in the hallway had stood nearly to the ceiling, a lovely thing in dark oak. Its brass face her father had polished every Sunday. It was the last to go. Maren had watched it carried through the doorway with the same careful face she had worn for all the rest. A charitable recommendation had come from the rector of the neighbouring parish. He had been her father's dear friend for 30 years. She had not asked him for the favour. He had offered it, and she had said yes. And now, here she was. Mrs. Tolley was waiting inside the servants' entrance. She was a small woman with a large ring of keys. Her expression suggested she had been waiting, specifically and without pleasure, for some time. She looked Maren over once, offered neither greeting nor reproach, and turned to lead her through. The servants' passage ran along the east side of the palace. It smelled of tallow and cold stone, and faintly of beeswax from somewhere deeper in the house. Maren followed with her trunk handle in one hand, watching her footing on the worn flags. Near the east corridor she noticed a door, iron, set into the wall. There was no handle visible on this side, and the lock appeared to have been recently oiled. She slowed, just for a moment. "The east wing is not your concern," Mrs. Tolley said, without turning. She had not appeared to look back. Maren said nothing and followed. She filed the door away quietly, the way her father had taught her to file facts that had not yet disclosed their meaning. Her room was at the top of the house, a small space under the eaves, a narrow window, a bed that had been made up some time ago. Frost had formed along the lower edge of the glass. She set her trunk on the floor and knelt to open it. There was not much inside: folded linens, a spare apron, hairpins wrapped in a cloth square. And at the very bottom, wrapped in the same cloth her father had always used, was a single volume. The poems of William Cowper, an old edition with a worn spine. On the inside page, in her father's handwriting, was an inscription she knew by heart, but read again anyway. It was the one thing she had not sold. She lifted it carefully and placed it on the window-sill where the frost had retreated just enough. She left it there in the cold, pale light. The evening bell rang somewhere deep in the palace. Below, through the small glass, The yard had gone dark. The great pale stones of Carendon caught the last trace of winter light along their upper edges. The building seemed to be holding something it did not yet mean to release. Maren stood at the window and looked at it for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, to no one at all, "Well, here I am." There was no self-pity in it. There was, perhaps, something careful and small, something that had not yet found its footing, but intended to. She turned from the window and began to unpack. The candles in the long gallery were lit before the guests arrived. Maren helped carry the tapers, one by one, from the store cupboard below. Her arms ached by the third journey up. Mrs. Tolley had said nothing that morning beyond a number, 42 candelabras, the East Gallery alone. Maren understood that to mean, do not speak, do not pause, and above all, do not be seen. The palace dressed itself for a prince's winter reception the way a great woman dresses for a portrait, slowly, with deliberate ceremony. Footmen in scarlet livery moved through the corridors with the unhurried precision of men who understood their role in the composition. Maren and the under-housemaids were not part of the composition. They were the hands that held the frame. She took her place along the gallery wall as the court began to fill. Silk moved against marble, voices rose and braided into a warm, expensive hum. Maren kept her eyes at middle distance. The housemaids studied nowhere gaze. She had learned it in her first week. Look at nothing. See everything. Say nothing at all. Prince Leopold entered the hall when the clock had passed 7. Maren did not permit herself to look directly. She registered him the way one registers fire, by warmth and peripheral light. He was taller than she had expected from the portraits. He moved without performance, which surprised her. There was no arrangement to his arrival, no lifted chin. He simply walked in and took his place, and the room reconfigured itself around him, without his asking. The reception had been underway perhaps half an hour when Thomas, a second footman, young and perpetually hurried, misjudged the corner of a side table near the window alcove. Maren heard the knock before she saw it. The painted Sèvres vase, the one Mrs. Tolley had described in tones usually reserved for scripture, tilted from its plinth. Maren moved before thought arrived. Her hands closed around the porcelain while her elbow absorbed the stone of the plinth's edge, and she set the vase back in a single unhurried motion as though it had never moved at all. Thomas went white. She did not look at him. She returned to the wall. No one applauded. No one remarked upon it. The court continued its warm, expensive hum. A woman in yellow silk laughed at something she had already been laughing at before the vase moved. 2 gentlemen discussed a horse. The chandeliers did not flicker. It was as if the moment had not occurred, which was, Maren understood, exactly as it should be. She felt the gaze a moment later. It was not the gaze of rebuke or suspicion. It was a different quality of attention entirely. She raised her eyes from middle distance and found him looking at her from across the room. Prince Leopold, 28 years of age and apparently the only person in a hall of 60 who had noticed what had happened by the window alcove. His expression was quite still. He was not smiling. He was simply looking, with the focused patience of a man who had seen something and intended to keep it. It was not a warm look. It was not anything so simple. It was the attention of a man who had been surprised by something he had not expected, and was deciding quietly what to make of it. Maren looked away at once. She returned her gaze to the composed middle distance, a correct nowhere gaze, a housemaid's nowhere. The room moved on, but she had found him looking, and he had known that she had found him. Neither had held the gaze for more than a breath. That was all. That was the entire length of it. Thomas whispered to her later, in the passage behind the service door. Will they notice the vase was shifted? He meant, will I be blamed? It is exactly where it was, Maren said quietly. She meant, I took care of it. He nodded and went ahead. She did not follow immediately. She stood a moment in the passage and breathed. The music reached her even there, muffled through two sets of doors, faint and remote as something heard under water. In the scullery afterward, while she cleaned the taper holders one by one, Maren permitted herself to think about the vase. Mrs. Tolley had said it belonged to the late Queen, that it was perhaps irreplaceable, that it was not to be touched by any hand below a senior housemaid on pain of immediate dismissal. Maren had touched it. She had touched it with bare hands in front of 60 guests and a prince. If anyone had properly registered the moment she would be spoken to in the morning, she would be let go without a character reference, and she would have no recourse and no income and nowhere to return. She scrubbed the brass and thought about this with the methodical care she brought to all problems. She did not think about anything else, or so she told herself in the quiet of the scullery, with the sound of distant music still faintly reaching her through the stone. There was, of course, a great deal more she might have thought about, but she was careful. She was always careful. And she returned the taper holders to their shelf in perfect order and wiped her hands and went up to bed. The morning after the winter reception, frost had not lifted from the eastern casements. It clung instead to the glass as if the house itself were holding its breath, uncertain of what the day was about to require. Maren carried the silver salver to the luncheon sideboard at 11:30, her footsteps soundless on the turkey carpet, her eyes correctly forward. The dining room held perhaps 14 guests, several still wearing the faint satisfaction of the previous evening's wine. Lord Fenton stood at the head table, a sealed document before him, his hands folded above it. His expression was the one chamberlains wear when they have done their work well and know it. He broke the seal without theatre. He read without inflection, as men read proclamations that require no persuasion. The Privy Council, in consideration of succession and alliance, had determined that His Royal Highness Prince Leopold would enter into formal betrothal with the Lady Aurelia Vane, eldest daughter of the Earl of Grain, before the winter solstice assembly. Maren set down the water carafe. Her hands did not tremble. She noted, with a kind of careful calm, that her hands did not tremble, and she was grateful for it. The cold she felt had no name she was permitted to use. It arrived, nonetheless, settling behind the sternum slow and exact, the way cold enters a room through a crack one had not thought to find. She had no right to it. She was aware she had no right to it. The decree concerned a prince. She was a housemaid who had caught a vase in the dark and been noticed for perhaps 3 seconds by a man across a crowded hall. She told herself this plainly. She arranged the water glasses with care. The cold did not move. Lady Aurelia Vane was already known to several at the table, and their murmurs told Maren what their faces confirmed. The lady was precisely as a future princess ought to be. She arrived in the doorway an hour later, when Maren was still clearing the service, and the room received her as a room receives something it has long been promised. She was tall, gowned in deep blue, trimmed with silver, a single strand of seed pearls at her throat. Her hair was dressed with art made invisible. She moved with the particular ease of a woman who has never doubted that rooms would arrange themselves around her. Her smile was warm and offered with precision. She extended her hand to each guest with exactly the right pressure, the right duration, the right tilt of her chin. Every small gesture was chosen, and every choice was right. Maren watched from the sideboard, her hands occupied with the carafe and the unnecessary arranging of already straight silverware. Lady Aurelia's graciousness was fluent, practised, and entirely sincere. That, Maren thought, was the most difficult kind to account for. Leopold arrived later in the afternoon. He had been riding. He brought with him the smell of cold air and horse leather, and something of the winter itself, the rawness of it that the carpeted corridors could not usually contain. Lord Fenton met him at the door of the study with the manner of a man who had rehearsed his words twice and trusted them. "Your Highness, the Council received confirmation this morning. The Earl of Grain has agreed in principle. The betrothal may be announced at the solstice assembly as planned." Leopold stood by the window. He looked at the frost-covered yard beyond the glass, the bare lindens, a groom crossing the cobbles below with slow, deliberate steps. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You have done well, Fenton." Lord Fenton permitted himself a small measure of satisfaction. The alliance is sound, the Vane line is distinguished, Lady Aurelia's reputation is without blemish. Your Highness does the Crown a great service. Leopold did not turn from the window. He said, "I have always done what was required, Fenton. I see no reason to begin doing otherwise." The Chamberlain paused, hearing the words and perhaps wondering briefly what manner of agreement they constituted. He chose not to wonder further. He gathered his papers with efficiency and withdrew. Maren had no business in the east corridor at dusk. She had finished her duties an hour prior. She ought to have gone directly to the servants' hall. She walked the long passage toward the servants' stair out of a habit she had not examined, the same route she had taken twice before, for reasons she had not examined either. The lamps had not yet been lit along this stretch. The winter light through the tall windows was the colour of pewter, fading fast toward nothing. Leopold was standing alone at the last window before the turning. He faced the glass, one hand resting on the sill. He did not appear to hear her step. Maren walked. She kept her eyes on the doorway at the passage's end. She passed him at a distance of perhaps 5 feet, her footsteps even, her face composed in the correct direction. She did not slow. She did not look. She heard nothing. She reached the servants' stair and descended without pausing. On the landing, she stopped a moment, one hand on the cold iron rail, and breathed once, carefully, as a person breathes when they are deciding not to think about something. Behind her, at the window, the frost continued its quiet work on the glass, and Leopold's hand, which had rested loosely on the sill, had tightened, not enough for anyone to see, but enough to press the cold into his palm and hold it there. The east wing received the morning light last. By the time it reached the library windows, it had travelled the full length of Carendon's great stone flank, and arrived thin and pale, as though the house itself had retained the warmest portion for its own use. Maren stood in the doorway with her cloth and her candle and allowed her eyes to adjust. Mrs. Tolley had given the assignment without ceremony. The east wing shelves were to be dusted before the assembly guests arrived. The locked iron door, it seemed, guarded nothing more fearful than books. The key was cold in Maren's hand, and the room beyond was colder still, yet not unpleasantly so. Cedar and beeswax rose to meet her. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on three sides, interrupted only by a single tall window and a reading table of dark walnut whose surface bore no mark of recent use. The candle threw long shadows across gilt-lettered spines. The house was quiet in this part of itself. Maren moved along the nearest shelf and began her work. She was methodical. She had been trained to be. Her cloth moved from left to right, volume by volume, touching each spine with the care her father had once reserved for the pages of his prayer book. She was nearly to the far window when she saw it. The spine was worn at the top corner, in a way she recognized. The lettering was familiar in a way that lived below thought, below language. She drew the volume out and held it in both hands. William Cowper. The same dark boards, the same modest gilt. She had sold her father's copy along with a long case clock and the 3 Wedgwood pieces his sister had left him. She had not sold this edition because she had not owned it. She opened to a page at random and read a single quatrain. Her lips did not move. It was not a moment she had planned, and so she was entirely unprepared for what it cost her. She did not hear the door open. The prince stopped 2 paces inside the room. He had been here before. His body found the silence of the library easily, without apology. He came when the court grew too loud and the evening felt too long, and he required something to think about that was not lineage or alliances or the quality of Lady Aurelia Vane's graciousness. He had not expected anyone. Maren looked up. Neither of them spoke at once. The candle between them did not waver. "I beg your pardon," she said at last. "I was assigned to dust the shelves. I stopped. I should not have stopped." "What do you read?" he asked. She turned the spine toward him. "Cowper, Your Highness." He was still. Something in his expression did not change so much as deepen, the way winter water deepens when the frost takes the surface. "I know that edition," he said. "My father kept this same one," she said. "He kept it on the left side of his desk, where he could reach it without looking." She stopped. She had not meant to say so much. "I'm sorry, that is more than you asked." "It is exactly what I asked," he said. He stepped to the table and set his own candle down. He did not take the book, but looked at the open page as though reading alongside her. She told him a little of her father then, the small parish at Harding, the cold stone church in winter, the way Reverend Thomas Ashwell corrected his sermons in pencil, because he always believed he might yet improve them. She said it plainly, without decoration, and without seeking any particular response. Leopold listened. He was, she noticed, unusually still. Men of his position were often in motion, arranging themselves, projecting an ease that required effort. He was not doing that. He was simply present. "Will you permit me?" he said, when she had finished. He took the volume from her hands with a careful regard she associated with handling fragile things. He turned to a page near the back and found it without difficulty, as one does who has sought that page before. He read aloud in a quiet voice that carried no performance. How various his employments, whom the world calls idle, and who justly in return esteems that busy world an idler, a mere vagrant. He closed the book and returned it. "My mother was fond of that passage," he said. He offered nothing further. Maren tucked the Cowper back into its place on the shelf. She gathered her cloth. She made herself move at the pace of someone who was simply completing a task and had not been altered by it in any recognizable way. She curtsied at the door. "Miss Ashwell," he said, behind her. She paused. He said nothing more. The name had not been a summons. It had been, she understood only later, something quieter than that, as though he were confirming to himself that he had it right, as though it were a word he intended to keep. She walked back through the servants' passage, carrying the candle and the cloth, and the particular stillness of someone who has understood something they are not yet ready to name. She did not look back. The east wing held the cold differently from the rest of Carendon. Elsewhere the palace breathed and settled, fires lit in every principal room, warmth maintained where wealth required it. Here the cold was older. It sat in the stone the way memory sits in a place, not unwelcome, simply present, as if it had always been and intended no alteration. Maren carried her dust cloth and her composure in equal measure when she returned to the East Wing Library the following morning. She had told herself it was duty that brought her back. She had told herself she would not look for the book. She looked for the book. The Cowper volume had been moved. It sat at the near end of the reading table, precisely where her hands would fall without reaching. She stopped in the doorway. She breathed once, slowly, the way she had learned to breathe when a task required more of her than she intended to give it. Then she crossed the room. A sprig of rosemary lay pressed between the pages, brown at its edges and still faintly fragrant, as if the herb had carried summer a little way into winter before surrendering. Someone had placed it at the poem she had been reading when he had found her there. Not approximately. At that poem on that page, at the verse she had half memorized before she heard his footstep. She touched the dried sprig with the tip of one finger. The leaves did not crumble. She set her finger back at her side. She understood what it meant. She understood also why it was impossible. Entirely, precisely impossible in the way that mathematical things are impossible, not as a wish refused, but as a fact that cannot be otherwise arranged. She was Maren Ashwell, 23 years of age, the daughter of a country rector whose estate had resolved to a handful of debts and one volume of verse. He was a prince of the realm. The Privy Council had read a decree at luncheon. Lady Aurelia Vane was to stand beside him at the winter solstice assembly. These were the coordinates of the world, and the world was not in the habit of consulting housemaids about its arrangements. She picked up her dust cloth. She turned to the nearest shelf. The shelf did not need dusting. She had dusted it 3 days previous, and it had not gathered anything worth removing. She dusted it again anyway, working slowly from left to right, touching each spine in turn, making a small and purposeful sound in the silence of the room. The house was very quiet around her. Outside the frost-rimed window, the kitchen garden lay grey and bare. Last season's lavender bundled and tied against the weather, waiting for a spring that had not consulted anyone about its arrival. She stood at the window until her hands grew cold. She was not thinking, she told herself. She was simply standing. The cold came up through the glass in a way that was almost companionable, pressing gently against her palms, asking nothing of her in return. Then she went back to the table. She did not have paper of her own. A housemaid at Carendon did not carry paper, but there was a writing desk near the north wall fitted with plain cream stock for the household's use, and no one had told her she could not open it. She lifted the lid. She took a single sheet. She returned to the reading table and opened the Cowper at the marked page. Her father had taught her to write with care. He had corrected her hand many times, gently and without impatience, until the letters stood evenly and upright, without flourish or affectation. She copied one line in that careful schoolroom script, pressing lightly so the ink would not blot. The line was from a poem about a winter garden, about things that live quietly beneath the snow and are not dead but only patient. She did not write her name. She folded the page once cleanly along its centre. She opened the front cover of the Cowper. The inside board was plain, cream-coloured, entirely unmarked. She tucked the folded paper there at the inner spine, where it would lie flat and not fall and would not be immediately visible to anyone who opened the book without looking. She closed the book. She set it back in precisely the position she had found it. Then she stood still for a moment with her hands at her sides. "That is enough," she said to herself, very quietly, in the way her father had sometimes said it at the end of a difficult day, not as defeat, but as a reckoning, a setting of the accounts in order before the next thing came. She picked up her dust cloth. She walked to the door. She did not look back at the reading table because she had decided, and, looking back, was the business of those who had not yet decided, and she was not that kind of woman. The library received her departure with its customary stillness. The cold resettled. The beeswax scent thickened a little, as it always did when the fire burned low. On the reading table the book of verse sat where she had placed it, rosemary still pressed within its pages, a single folded sheet of cream paper resting inside the front cover, both of them waiting, in the particular patience of things that have been given and have not yet been found. The dining room at Carendon held its warmth jealously on December evenings, the fire built high and the candles lit early against the failing afternoon light. Maren moved along the east wall with the wine, her steps measured, her face composed into the careful blankness that good service required. She had learned it quickly. The trick of being present in a room without existing in it, of hearing everything and registering nothing. The long table was set for 12, though fewer than that had come. Crystal caught the candlelight and threw small fires across the white linen. Lady Aurelia sat at Leopold's right hand, ivory and composed as ever, her chin lifted at a precise and practised angle. Maren filled the glass of the counsellor seated nearest the wall and moved one place to her left. She kept her eyes lowered. This was the rule. Eyes down, movement smooth, withdraw and return, as the rhythm of the meal demanded. She had settled into it, this second existence she led inside the larger one, close enough to hear the dinner conversation but never a participant in it. The fire spoke more than she did. The candles, at least, did not pretend. Lord Fenton was speaking of the Eastern Territories when Leopold reached for the decanter himself. It was a small thing. A man of his station did not reach for his own wine at table. That was precisely what the staff along the east wall were for. But Leopold's hand closed around the neck of the crystal, and he refilled his own glass with a quietness that suggested he had not forgotten the convention so much as chosen, briefly, to set it aside. Fenton's eyes moved to him and then away. They did not move to Maren, which might have been a mercy, or might have been something else entirely. "Your Highness asked after the Harding register," said Leopold, in a register kept low. Maren had reached his end of the table. She paused to pour. He did not look up. "Your father served at Harding, Miss Ashwell. For how long?" The question was quiet enough that only Maren and the councillor beside her could have heard it, and the councillor was occupied with his soup. She answered him in the same register. "Near 17 years, Your Highness. He came to the parish when I was 6. Leopold turned his glass once on the linen. "Cowper was a favourite in our household also," he said. He was looking at his plate, not at her, which was correct. "My mother read from that same edition when I was 9 years old. She preferred the task above the rest." He said it simply, without the careful arrangement people sometimes put around mentions of the dead. "She has been gone 4 years now." "I'm sorry for it," Maren said. She meant it plainly, without adornment, the way her father had taught her to receive another person's grief, not with excess, but with careful attention. Leopold lifted his glass and set it down again. "Your father," he said, still quietly, "you told me he died before he could complete his work." "He was correcting a proof," Maren said, "for a sermon he had written but never delivered. He set down his pen in the evening and did not take it up in the morning." She had not spoken of it directly in some time. The words came without difficulty, which surprised her. He was very particular about his sentences. He would have been displeased that it remained unfinished. Leopold was quiet for a moment. Around them the dinner continued in its slow rhythm. Silver against china, the soft motion of candles in the draught that came from the corridor door. Then he said, "That sounds exactly like him." Maren looked up. She had not meant to. Leopold was looking at the candle nearest him, his expression private and unhurried, and she understood in that instant that he had been doing something she had not fully realized, collecting her father from the small things she had let fall, assembling the man from fragments, the way a scholar restores a text from scattered pages. He had been paying attention not just to her, but to what she brought with her. "It does," she said, after a moment. "It does sound exactly like him." She moved on to the next glass. The dinner turned its slow course around the table. She did not look toward Lady Aurelia. She did not need to. She was aware of her the way one is aware of weather, a presence at the edge of attention, neither dismissed nor confronted. When, some minutes later, the necessity of a water pitcher brought Maren near enough to observe the far side of the table, Aurelia's face held its habitual pleasantness without alteration. Her eyes moved briefly to Maren and then returned to Leopold. She did not frown. She did not tighten her mouth. She gave no sign of having noted anything at all. That was the detail Maren carried with her when the dinner concluded and the staff retired to the kitchen passage. Not the displeasure, which she might have understood, not the sharpness, which she might have predicted. Only the unchanged expression, smooth and unhurried, a woman who had seen something and decided exactly how much she would allow it to cost her. Outside the kitchen window the frost had settled across the stone courtyard, white and still, and the night pressed close against the glass with a patience that required no hurry at all. Maren set down her tray and did not speak of what the evening had held. She did not need to. The afternoon light had grown thin by the time the summons came. It arrived in the form of a housemaid named Clara, who spoke without meeting Maren's eyes. Lady Aurelia Vane wished to see her. The Rose Suite, 3rd floor, East Corridor. At once, if she pleased. Maren set down her polishing cloth. She smoothed her apron. She went. The Rose Suite was warm with fire and the scent of something powdery and sweet. Lady Aurelia sat at her dressing table with her back to the door. She watched Maren's reflection in the glass as she entered. The room's maid stood near the wardrobe. Aurelia said, without turning, "You may go, Susan." Susan went. The door closed with a small and deliberate sound, like a hand placed flat on a surface. Maren stood. She kept her hands still at her sides. Aurelia turned at last. She was in an afternoon gown of pale grey silk, with a single pearl at her throat. She wore it, with the ease of a woman who has never worn anything else. She gestured toward a low chair, near the fire. "Sit, please." Her voice was pleasant. Pleasantness, Maren understood, was not always a kindness. She sat. "I have been observing this household for some weeks," Aurelia said. She moved to the window and looked out. "It is a very fine palace. One notices things in a fine palace when one is paying attention." She was quiet a moment. Outside, bare branches moved against a white sky. "You have been to the East Wing Library, I think, several times." Maren said nothing. "And at the dinner 2 evenings past, His Highness served his own wine." Aurelia turned. Her expression was composed. "That is not a thing he does, Miss Ashwell. Not in 14 years of observation." She crossed the room slowly and sat in the chair opposite. Her hands rested in her lap, ungloved, very still. "I asked Susan, the maid you saw leave, to look at the Cowper volume in the library. She found pressed rosemary inside it." Aurelia smiled. It did not travel to her eyes. It was thoughtful, as gestures go. The fire crackled. A coal shifted. Maren felt the warmth of it on her left cheek. "I do not blame you," Aurelia said. Her tone was gentle. It was the gentleness of something polished long enough to remove all roughness. "Clever girls in difficult positions make errors in judgment. It is understandable. You are young, you are alone, and the man is not without quality." She examined one of her rings, turning it slightly. "But I think you understand that there is only one outcome here that is possible." "My lady," Maren said. Aurelia raised a hand. "Let me finish." She looked up. "I will speak to Mrs. Tolley. This is not a punishment, it is a correction. Mrs. Tolley is a reasonable woman. I expect she will agree that a placement so close to the family's private quarters is not suited to a girl of your particular sensibilities." She paused. "I will also send a note to the agency that placed you. Nothing formal, only that certain lines of appropriate conduct proved blurred." She folded her hands. "Without a written character from either party, your next placement becomes a matter of considerable difficulty. You understand?" It was not a question. Maren looked at her. She had been afraid walking the corridor. The fear had not gone. But there was something steadier beneath it, and that steadiness surprised her. She thought of her father, and of the way he had faced what was difficult. He had stood before a vestry committee once over a question of doctrine. He had stood with his hands at his sides and said what was true. She had been 12 years old. She had not forgotten. "I have done nothing I am ashamed of, my lady," she said. The room was very quiet. Aurelia's expression did not change, and yet something in it shifted. Some barely perceptible alteration, like a line drawn on paper by a very fine pen. The pleasantness thinned. Beneath it was something harder and older and far less patient. "That was not the answer I expected," she said at last. "I know, my lady." Aurelia stood. The interview was ended. She moved back to the dressing table as if Maren had already ceased to be present. "You may go, Miss Ashwell. I would ask that you give thought, before morning, to what a girl without a character reference finds available to her in winter." She picked up a brush and drew it through her hair, once. "I have found that such thoughts tend to clarify priorities." Maren stood. She dipped a curtsy. She left. The corridor outside the rose suite was cold after the fire. She walked it carefully, with her hands very still at her sides. She passed a window. The sky beyond it was the colour of old pewter, darkening at its edges. She thought, mechanically, of which tasks remained before supper. The silver in the east drawing-room, the coal scuttle on the second landing. She thought of nothing else, because if she thought of anything else she would not reach the attic with any dignity remaining. In the attic she sat on the edge of her narrow bed. The Cowper volume stood on the frost-rimed window-sill where she had moved it that morning. She looked at it for a moment, then she pressed her face into her hands briefly, without sound. She allowed herself a few minutes and no more. She was her father's daughter. He had always said that grief was not the enemy, only the waste of it was. She lifted her head. She folded her hands in her lap. The cold came in at the window's edge. The palace settled around her, very still. She sat there in the dark with the quiet patience of someone who has decided, long before this evening, what she is worth. The frost came harder that week, sealing the upper windows with white. Maren rose before light, as she always had, and arranged her day with care. She took the linen route through the north passage. She carried fresh tallow to the servants' hall and the boot room. She did not go near the east wing. There was nothing remarkable in this. The east wing required fewer hands in the mornings, and Mrs. Tolley had said so herself months ago. Maren had simply begun to agree with Mrs. Tolley. She had wrapped the Cowper volume the night before in a square of calico. She had not opened it. She carried it down 2 flights at 5:30 before any other housemaid stirred. She placed it on the wooden tray at the end of the north corridor, where misshelved books and misplaced objects collected dust until someone returned them. She set beside it a slip of paper, folded once, in her careful schoolroom hand. Found displaced from the East Wing library she had written, returned with apologies for the delay. She had not signed it. There was nothing to sign. She had not taken anything. She had simply borrowed a library she was not meant to borrow. She was giving it back now, and that was the whole of it. She walked back upstairs with her hands very still. The days arranged themselves. She answered when she was spoken to. She was quick with the fire irons and quiet on the back staircase. She grew expert at entering and leaving rooms without the door announcing her. Mrs. Tolley paused one morning and said, "You are improving, Ashwell." Maren said, "Thank you, ma'am," and meant it, in a way. She did not think of the library. She thought of her father's handwriting, which was nothing like her own. She thought of the particular smell of beeswax and cedar that lived in cold stone rooms. She let herself think of these things because they were not dangerous. They did not belong to anyone still living. She arranged them tidily and placed them where she placed everything she could not afford to keep close, and she got on with the work. There was a great deal of work. The assembly preparations had begun in earnest. Hothouse flowers arrived by cart every second morning, their petals pale against the frost. The hall floor required 2 extra polishings. Maren did not mind the extra polishings. She preferred being useful in large and impersonal ways, hauling cloth and setting out silver. She moved through rooms that were too busy for any one face to be remembered. She passed Leopold once in the outer yard on a Thursday. She knew it was him before she turned. She had not anticipated the yard. She had thought herself safe in the yard. She kept her eyes level as she had been trained and continued walking. He was speaking to Lord Fenton or perhaps to the stable master. She did not look. She was already past him by the time she heard his footsteps slow. She did not slow. She went through the side door and along the passage and stood in the scullery a moment with her eyes on the stone wall until her breathing settled. She told herself this was proof the thing was working. The yard had happened and she had managed it. That was all the yard was. She heard, as housemaids hear everything without intending to, that the betrothal papers were being drawn, that a jeweller had come from the city, that Lady Aurelia had been fitted for a gown. Maren heard these things at the margins of rooms. She set them down as she set down the silver tureens after supper, cleanly, without noise, in their proper place. The preparations moved through the palace like weather. She moved through the preparations. Neither noticed the other, or so she arranged it. She did not count the days until the assembly. She had no reason to count them. On the 4th evening she climbed to her attic and set her candle on the trunk beside the door. The room was small and cold, as it had always been. The frost had crept back along the pane. She undid her cap and set it on the nail and looked toward the narrow sill, because the sill was where she rested her eyes at the end of long days. The Cowper volume was there. She stood very still. She looked at it for some time. She had placed it on the tray 3 mornings ago, wrapped in calico, with the unsigned note. She had not touched it since. She crossed the room and lifted it carefully, as one lifts something that might not be real. It was solid. The cover was the same, worn smooth at the spine. She opened the front board with 2 fingers. Her folded note was still inside. She could not tell whether it had been unfolded. The crease was soft, but it had always been soft. She held the book a moment in both hands. Then she set it back upon the sill exactly where it had been and turned away. She did not sleep quickly. The candle burned down to nothing. Outside, the frost continued its patient work upon the glass, indifferent as houses sometimes are to the small, tender weight of what passes within them. The frost that night was not a gentle thing. It had settled into the stone bones of Carendon with the patience of something that had always lived there. Maren could not sleep. She lay with the Cowper volume under her hand and the cold pressing up through the attic floorboards, and at last she rose. She wrapped her shawl about her shoulders, took her candle, and went down the back stairs to the scullery for water. She did not expect to find anyone in the servants' passage. At this hour, Carendon grew as quiet as a chapel between prayers. The corridor was lit by a single wall sconce, and in its warm pool, not 6 feet from where she stopped, stood Prince Leopold. He was not in court dress. He carried no candle of his own. He stood with the particular stillness of a man who had come to Coldstone in order to think, and had not yet decided if he had managed it. She nearly turned back. On any other night, she would have, but her feet did not carry her away. He saw her in the same moment she saw him. Neither spoke. The wall sconce burned its single orange flame above them, and the frost pressed against the passage window, and Carendon held its breath. "Miss Ashwell," he said quietly. "Your Highness." She steadied her voice. "I was only going to the scullery." "Yes," he said. He did not step aside, not unkindly, simply present. "What did she say to you?" Maren looked at the flagstone beneath her feet. She held her candle a little higher. "It does not matter." "It matters to me." She said nothing for a moment. The corridor had a silence to it like cold cloth. Then she said what a woman in her position might reasonably say, Your Highness. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I would like you to know that I know what she is." Maren looked at him directly now. "I know what I am also," she said. "I know what you are as well." His voice was low, level, unhurried. "Where you stand and what you are worth are not the same coordinates, Miss Ashwell. I should like you to hold that distinction." The frost had crept beneath the passage window. She could feel it on her bare hands, her candle warming only her fingers. She looked at his face in the sconce light. She thought that she would remember this particular light, this particular cold, the precise width of 6 feet, and how formal it was and how utterly insufficient. "I'm glad I came to Carendon," she said at last. He waited. He did not fill the space with reassurance. She thought of the East Wing Library. She thought of morning frost on the window pane above the reading table and Cowper open between them, and his voice reading verse as if it were simply the most natural thing. She thought of rosemary pressed flat, and a folded page in her own hand. She had not chosen any of it. She had simply not looked away. "The library," she said. "I will not forget the library, or Cowper, or the rosemary." She paused only a moment. "Whoever you must become tomorrow, I hope there is room in that person for the man who read aloud in a cold room, and did not find it strange to speak with a housemaid of verse." Something moved in his face. It was not very much. It was enough. "I am sorry," he said, "for all of it." She shook her head. "You need not be." She looked at him evenly. "I am not sorry either." She meant it fully. He could see that she meant it, which was perhaps the harder thing for him to carry. "Nothing was done to me that I did not choose to walk toward." The words settled between them like something set down carefully after a long carrying. He looked at her in the sconce light as though assembling her from all the small facts he had collected. A court vase, a Cowper passage spoken without thinking, a rosemary sprig left and left again. He said her name then, not Miss Ashwell, with the 6 feet, and the formality built into it like stone. Not Your Highness returned, the distance measured and kept. He said simply, "Maren." Low, plain, entirely without performance. She looked at him for a held moment. She felt the cold of the passage in her hands and in her feet, and in all of her. Then she nodded once. It was a small and deliberate thing. She walked past him to the scullery, poured her water, and drank it at the stone basin with her eyes on the dark window. She did not rush. She did not linger. When she came back through the passage, he was gone. The wall sconce burned on alone, its orange unchanged, entirely indifferent, as if it did not know what it had been asked to witness. She climbed back to her attic. She did not sleep. She lay with the Cowper under her palm and the night deepening around Carendon, the frost settling further into the eaves, and she thought that there were things a person could keep without holding them, if she was careful enough, and very quiet. The morning would come with its ceremony and its expectation and its debt owed to lineage, but the night was still the night. She had kept something in it. She told herself that was enough, and listened to the old stone of Carendon settle and breathe as it had through every winter it had known, caring nothing for what small lives moved within it. The morning of the winter solstice assembly arrived without ceremony for those who served. Frost still clung to the outer casements when Mrs. Tolley assigned Maren her station, 6th position, along the south wall of the great hall, beside the tall pier glass and the arrangement of forced white hothouse roses. The roses had been cut at midnight, Maren supposed, to be properly open by noon. Someone had thought of that. Someone always thought of such things at Carendon. The hall itself was another creature by day. Maren had swept its floors in November's thin light, carrying a broom that whispered against cold stone. Now the stone was hidden beneath a runner of deep crimson, and the 4 iron chandeliers blazed with 200 candles apiece. Evergreen boughs dressed the upper gallery in the scent of resin and cold pine. The hothouse roses stood in silver urns at every pillar, white against December dark, as though the season had been argued with and lost. The palace had put on its full face. Maren had pressed her cleanest apron that morning before dawn, which was the only equivalent available to her. The court assembled from 11 o'clock onward. They came in pairs and in clusters, silk murmuring against marble, the soft percussion of heeled shoes. Maren watched their reflections in the pier glass without watching them directly, which was a skill a housemaid learned early. She kept her hands folded at her waist and her eyes at the middle distance. She was very good at this now. She had been practicing all week. Lady Aurelia Vane entered at 1/4 the hour. Maren felt it before she looked. A change in the room's attention, a subtle orientation of 100 faces, like birds taking the same wind. She looked. Aurelia wore ivory silk with a deep sapphire sash and sapphire drops at her ears, and she wore it as a woman wears something she already owns. Her hair was dressed in the height of the French manner, very high, threaded with seed pearls. She was, in any honest accounting, magnificent. She moved through the parting court with a smile that acknowledged nothing and claimed everything. Maren thought, quite without rancour, that Aurelia had been preparing for this morning since girlhood, perhaps since infancy. Lord Fenton appeared at the hall's upper end and made some disposition of the waiting company. Maren did not follow the particulars. She kept her breathing even and her posture correct, and thought about the pressed rosemary she had carried all this week in the pocket of her working dress, which she had finally put away this morning for a reason she could not have articulated. Prince Leopold entered at 11:30. He came through the double doors in full regalia, the dark military coat with its gold orders, white gloves, the small sword at his hip. He was not the easiest thing in the room to look at. He was the only thing in the room that Maren looked at. The court made its appropriate movement, a coordinated lowering and rising. Fenton spoke something near his ear. Leopold acknowledged the room with the courteous gravity that Maren had come to understand was his public face, a face that said nothing and gave nothing away and cost him something each time he wore it. His eyes crossed the south wall. They found her. It was a single beat, a half-second, no more. Then his gaze moved on, and Maren looked away, and the room continued its business, and probably no one had caught it. She did not know what she had seen in his face. She had learned these past days, not to attempt to translate it. The arrangements proceeded. Fenton marshalled the company toward the dais and the formal arc of court chairs. Aurelia took her position with the ease of a woman who had rehearsed and the grace of a woman who did not seem to have. She glanced once toward the south wall, a glance that lasted precisely as long as was needed to locate Maren and confirm that Maren had observed her. Then Aurelia's gloved hand opened, and her right glove fell to the floor. It landed softly at Maren's feet. The hall was loud with the murmur of assembled company. In that noise the small, quiet event was nearly invisible. Nearly. Aurelia turned, her eyes already on a point just above Maren's head, waiting. Maren bent her knee and retrieved the glove from the crimson runner. She straightened. She presented it, folded correctly, across her palm. Aurelia took it without a word and without a glance downward, and with the particular ease of a woman receiving a thing she is owed. Then she turned back toward the dais and the pearl-lit room, and Lord Fenton, and the order of the morning. Maren replaced her hands at her waist. She looked at the pier glass. She looked at the hothouse roses, brilliant and scentless in their silver urn, cut for this occasion and unlikely to outlast it. She kept her breathing even. Leopold stood at the dais step, white-gloved hands at his sides. He had seen all of it. The line of his jaw was very still, as if he were doing careful arithmetic, and had arrived at a number he did not care for. Lord Fenton moved to his elbow. "The hour is nearly upon us, Your Highness," Fenton murmured. "Shall I signal the herald?" Leopold turned his head toward him. He looked at Fenton a moment. He said nothing. The hall gleamed and murmured and moved, ready for what was coming next, and the morning pressed forward, as mornings are required to do. The candles in the great chandelier had burned lower by an inch. That was what Maren noticed first, not the crowd, not the silk, not the sound of Lord Fenton clearing his throat at the lectern. The wax had softened in its cups. The hall was warm from so many gathered bodies, and the cold outside pressed at the high windows like a patient creditor. Lord Fenton opened the document with both hands. He held it at the height his ceremony required, and the parchment caught the candlelight and glowed faintly amber at its edges. The room went still in the way only rooms containing power can go still, a held breath, a suspension of will. Every face turned toward the dais, every face save one. Prince Leopold stood at the top step, arms at his side, eyes forward. He wore the full regalia of the house, dark coat, gold thread at the collar, the single ribbon of the order across his chest. His expression was composed. He had been trained to receive ceremony as a kind of weather, to stand inside it and endure. Lord Fenton began to speak. His voice was deep and practised, shaped by 40 years of palaces and proclamations. It moved through the hall like something with a weight. He named lineages. He named alliances. He named the honour of the crown and the dignity of the kingdom. The words were old. They had been spoken in this hall before. Aurelia moved. It was a small movement, precise and prepared. She had rehearsed her moment of approach, the angle of her shoulders, the measured step that would carry her forward before the final sentence. She understood what ceremony required of her. The hall watched her progress with quiet approval. Leopold heard the words. Each syllable arrived to him clearly, as it was meant to. His name was spoken several times. The name of Lady Aurelia Vane was spoken also. Perhaps 30 seconds remained between this moment and its conclusion. He let his gaze move then. Not urgently, slowly, in the way a man surveys a room he is leaving for the last time. The chandelier above cast its amber wash across the marble floor. The winter flowers in their urns along the south wall had opened further in the warmth, hothouse roses, ivory and deep red, breathing their faint sweetness into the air. He looked at the court. He saw faces he had known since childhood. He saw the women who had attended his mother in her last months at Carendon. He saw the men who had advised him through his father's death. He saw Lord Fenton's profile at the lectern, the document still raised, the voice continuing its appointed course. He saw Aurelia at the edge of his sight, paused at 4 steps from the dais, waiting for the final phrase. And then he looked at the south wall. Maren stood with the other housemaids, her eyes forward, her hands at rest. She had learned early at Carendon how to be present and absent at once. Her posture was straight, without effort. She heard Lord Fenton's voice and showed nothing. He could not know what she was thinking. He believed he did. He had been assembling the truth of her since autumn, from small things no one else had thought to keep. She had said she was glad she came. He had turned that sentence over in the night. He held it still. He had carried it since the stone corridor the night before, the single sconce between them, the frost working at the flags underfoot. She had said it without asking him for anything in return. She had said it the way one states a thing that is simply true and leaves it there. He thought of his mother, who had read Cowper to him when he was 9, her voice low and even in the fire-lit room. He thought of the folded note inside the book's front cover, its crease worn to softness from opening. He thought of a pressed sprig of rosemary, what it had cost him to leave it, what it had cost her to understand it and say nothing aloud. He thought of the East Wing Library on cold mornings, the quality of stillness that grows between 2 people who have already said enough. He thought of 6 feet of stone passage and the particular sound of her voice saying she was glad. And he thought, there is a direction I have not yet walked in this hall. Lord Fenton's voice continued. Aurelia was still. The court held its posture and its silence. The candles burned. Leopold stepped down from the dais. There was no hurry in it. He moved as a man moves when the decision has already been made in the deepest part of him, and the body is simply following. 1 step down and the hall floor was wide, and the court registered the change in his bearing before they registered the change in his direction. The understanding arrived in them like cold air through a door. They parted. The court stood on either side and did not speak, not because they were asked, because something moved through them that carried its own weight, and the body knows that weight before the mind has named it. Lord Fenton's voice stopped. It did not trail away. It stopped mid-sentence, as a man stops when the world has shifted beneath the word he is speaking. Aurelia did not move. She stood where ceremony had placed her, and she was very still, and her expression did not change, and that stillness was its own kind of answer. Leopold crossed the hall. He did not hurry. He did not look at the court, or the winter flowers, or the chandelier above, or the frost-edged windows. He looked at one thing only. He stopped before Maren Ashwell. The hall held its breath. The candles burned on, the cold pressed quietly at the glass. He stood before her, and the hall held its breath. The candelabras had not moved, the hothouse roses had not wilted, yet something had shifted entirely, as if the room itself had heard a question posed without words, and was waiting for an answer it had not expected to receive. Leopold did not speak at once. He looked at her, only at her, and then he bowed. It was a full court bow, the kind that custom reserved for sovereigns, the kind that no one in Carendon's long history had offered to a housemaid standing at the south wall. Maren did not move. She did not step back or lower her gaze or bring her hands to any useful task. She stood, and the bow was made, and it could not be unmade. The silence lasted perhaps 3 heartbeats, perhaps more. Fenton had ceased to read. Aurelia had not moved from her place near the dais, though her stillness now was a different kind from the stillness she had practised all season. Leopold straightened. He addressed the hall. His voice was quiet, but the hall was quieter. "Miss Maren Ashwell," he said, "daughter of the Reverend Thomas Ashwell of Harding Parish." He let the name settle in the air as a man sets down a candle in a dark room to illuminate what was there all along. He said that he had observed in the month since autumn's first frost a woman of uncommon dignity, one who caught what others permitted to fall, one who offered no false accounting of herself and made no appeal for what was not hers to claim. He said that honesty of that precise quality was a thing the crown ought to recognize and had too often overlooked. He would not, he told them, bind the future of that crown to an arrangement that his conscience had refused. He said it without drama, without the oratorial flourish that Fenton favoured. He simply stated it, as a man states a fact he has weighed carefully and found true. The court did not know immediately what to do with any of this. A few faces turned to one another, a few more remained fixed upon him in something approaching confusion. Lord Fenton had gone the colour of old linen. Leopold turned from the hall then and stepped closer to Maren by only a pace. His voice, when he spoke again, was not for the assembly. It was for her alone. "I have no right to ask anything of you," he said, "but I would like to begin by asking your permission to call upon your father's memory properly, and, if you will allow it, to know you without a door between us." He waited. He didn't look away. Whatever the hall thought, whatever Fenton calculated, whatever Aurelia chose in this or the next moment, it was not the thing he was attending to. He attended only to her answer. Maren held the silence for a count of 2. She was aware of the candles and the roses and the assembled court and the pale face of the chamberlain and the still white figure near the dais. She was aware of all of it. She set it to one side. "My father," she said, "would have said that you had very good taste in Cowper, Your Highness." Her voice was level. It did not shake. She let a small breath pass. Then she said, "Yes." That single syllable opened the hall like a window. Noise returned in waves. It was not the applause of a choreographed ceremony. It was the disordered sound of a room revising its understanding of something it had believed settled. Fenton turned away toward a pillar and stood there, holding his scroll. Lady Aurelia Vane descended from the dais without haste, without spectacle, without any remark that anyone heard or recorded. She left the way she had come. The ivory and sapphire moved through a side door, and the hall closed behind her, and that was the end of what had been arranged. Maren remained at the south wall, though the wall no longer defined her. Leopold stood beside her, and did not move her away. The hothouse flowers released their too sweet warmth into the cold December air. Someone near the west arch began to speak, quietly. Then someone else. The room filled slowly with the ordinary music of people in the presence of something unexpected and true. At the far end of the hall, the frost-rimed east window caught the morning light. The sun had shifted, as December suns will, briefly and without announcement, and the glass held the pale gold of it for a moment before the clouds resumed their watch. The house was very old. It had held many winters and many ceremonies and many arrangements that began in duty and concluded in silence. It had not often held this. Something in its old stones seemed to ease, as though a question asked for a very long time had at last been answered, not loudly, but truly and in full.